Hello, we are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are tackling a myth that stops so many people from finding happiness, the idea that it is too late to change. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through why your best chapters are still ahead of you.
And I am Abel. I am so glad to be here with you, Anna. Often, we feel like we missed our chance because of our age or our past mistakes. Today, we want to talk about how to use English to redefine your future and why the clock is never truly ticking against you.
That is such a beautiful way to introduce today's topic, Abel. And I want to start by saying something directly to everyone who is listening right now. If you have ever looked at your life and thought, I should have done this sooner, or I'm too old for this now, or everyone else is already ahead of me, then this episode was made specifically for you. We are going to walk through this idea very carefully and very slowly because it is something that deserves real attention.
I'm really glad we're talking about this, Anna, because honestly, I feel this way sometimes. I look at other people my age and I think, wow, they already have their career figured out, or they already speak perfect English, and I feel like I'm running behind, like there's a race happening and I started too late.
And that feeling, Abel, that feeling of being behind in a race, is one of the most common emotional experiences of modern life. But here's the first important thing I want us to think about together. That race, it was never real. The timeline that society gives us, finish school by this age, have a career by this age, be successful by this age, those timelines are not natural laws. They are social constructions. They are ideas that were created by culture, by advertising, by comparison, and by historical systems that do not actually apply to every individual human being.
What do you mean by social constructions? Can you explain that in a simple way?
Of course, think about it this way. 100 years ago, the average human life expectancy was around 50 years old. So in that world, it made some sense to say, you need to figure out your life by the time you are 25 or 30, because you only have so many years. But today, in many parts of the world, people are living to be 80, 90, even 100 years old. The entire timeline of a human life has changed dramatically, yet many of us are still operating with that old, outdated map. We're using a map that was drawn for a 50-year journey to navigate a 90-year journey. And when you use the wrong map, you feel lost even when you're not.
That is such a powerful image, Anna. The wrong map. So we're not actually behind, we're just using the wrong guide.
Exactly. And the pressure to succeed by a certain age comes from many places. It comes from social media, where we only see the highlight moments of other people's lives. It comes from our families, who love us and want security for us, but who sometimes pass on their own fears and timelines. It comes from advertising, which sells us the idea that youth is the most valuable thing a person can have. But none of these sources are telling you the full truth about human potential and human development.
That's interesting. So when I scroll through social media and see someone younger than me who seems more successful, I'm not actually seeing their real story. I'm seeing a carefully chosen moment.
Precisely. You're seeing the peak of the mountain in their photograph, but you're not seeing all the years of confusion, failure, wrong turns, and hard work that happened before that photograph was taken. And this is something that is very important for our English learners to understand too. When you watch a fluent English speaker in a video, you're not seeing all the hours they spent feeling frustrated, making mistakes, forgetting vocabulary, and feeling embarrassed. You're seeing the results of a long, invisible process, and that process is available to you no matter when you begin it.
I love that. And speaking of beginning late, I actually want to ask you about something. You mentioned before we started recording that starting something later in life can actually be an advantage. I found that really surprising. Can you talk about that?
Yes, and this is one of my favorite things to discuss because it genuinely surprises most people. We have this assumption that younger is always better when it comes to learning and changing. And while it is true that children learn certain things very quickly, like pronunciation in a new language, it is absolutely not true that adults are at a disadvantage in all ways. In fact, adults bring something to the learning process that children simply don't have yet, and that thing is lived experience.
What does lived experience mean exactly in this context?
Lived experience means all the things you have gone through in your life. Every job you've had, every relationship, every difficulty you've faced, every decision you've made, good and bad. All of that experience gives you something extraordinary. It gives you context. When you learn a new English word like resilience, for example, a child might memorize the dictionary definition, but you, as an adult who has survived difficult moments in your life, you understand that word in your body and in your heart. You know what resilience feels like from the inside. And that depth of understanding is a powerful tool for language learning and for personal growth.
Oh, I never thought about it that way. So my life experience is not a burden that slows me down, it's actually a resource that helps me understand things more deeply.
That's exactly right. And researchers in psychology and neuroscience have actually confirmed this. Adult learners tend to have stronger motivation, better study strategies, and a clearer sense of purpose than younger learners. When a child studies English, they often don't know why they're doing it. When you study English as an adult, you know exactly why. Maybe you want to communicate with people from other cultures. Maybe you want to travel or get a better job or understand your favorite music or films. That clarity of purpose is a massive advantage that children rarely have.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I want to move to something you mentioned called the sunk cost fallacy. I've heard this term before, but I'm not completely sure I understand it. What does it mean?
The sunk cost fallacy is a concept from economics and psychology, but it applies very powerfully to our personal lives. Let me explain it with a simple story. Imagine you buy a ticket to a movie for $20. You sit down, the movie starts, and after 30 minutes, you realize you hate it. The movie is boring, the story is bad, and you're not enjoying yourself at all. What do?
I think most people would stay and watch the whole movie, right? Because they already paid for the ticket.
Yes, and that is exactly the sunk cost fallacy in action. You stay in a bad situation not because it is good for you now, but because of what you already spent in the past. The money is already gone. Whether you stay or leave, that $20 is not coming back. So the logical thing to do is to make the best decision for your present self and your future self, not to keep suffering because of a past investment.
So the sunk cost fallacy is when we make present decisions based on what we already lost rather than what is actually best for us right now.
Perfectly explained, Abel. And this applies so directly to people who feel it is too late to change. Someone might say, I have spent 15 years in this career. If I change now, all those years were wasted. But that thinking is the sunk cost fallacy. Those 15 years are already spent. They are not coming back regardless of what you decide today. The real question is not, what have I already invested? The real question is, what is the best investment for the years I still have ahead of me?
Wow, that really changes the framing. Instead of looking backward and feeling guilty, we should be looking forward and asking what is possible from here.
Exactly. And there is something liberating about this idea when you truly absorb it. It means you do not have to justify your past to make a change. You do not have to prove that the last 10 or 20 years were worthless in order to say, I want something different now. You can honor everything you learned and experienced in your previous path and still say, from today, I am choosing a new direction. Those two things are not in conflict with each other.
That is really reassuring, because I think one of the things that stops people is they feel like changing means admitting failure, like they're saying, I was wrong this whole time.
And that feeling is so understandable, but it's not accurate. Changing direction is not the same as admitting failure. Growth requires change. Imagine a river. A river does not flow in a perfectly straight line. It curves around mountains, it changes direction when it encounters obstacles, and it finds new paths constantly. But we do not look at a river and say, that river failed because it changed direction. We look at a river and we see something powerful, natural, and alive. You are allowed to be like that river.
I love that metaphor. Okay, so let's say someone listening to us right now decides that yes, they do want to change something, whether it's their career, their language skills, their lifestyle, whatever it is. They want to make a change, but they feel overwhelmed. Like, where do you even start?
And this is where I want to talk about something I call the power of micro changes. Because I think one of the biggest mistakes people make when they decide to change their lives is that they think they need to make a dramatic, enormous leap all at once. They think, I need to quit my job tomorrow. I need to move to another country. I need to completely reinvent myself overnight. And that kind of thinking is actually counterproductive because it's overwhelming. And when something is overwhelming, we freeze.
Yes, I completely recognize that. You think about the huge goal, and it feels so far away that you don't even take the first step.
Exactly. And this is why micro changes are so powerful. A micro change is a tiny, almost invisible adjustment that you make to your daily life. It does not feel dramatic. It does not feel revolutionary. But over time, these tiny adjustments accumulate into extraordinary transformation. Think about it like this. If you improve something by just 1% every single day, at the end of 1 year, you are not 1% better. You are approximately 37 times better because improvements compound over time, just like interest in a bank account.
37 times better from just 1% a day? That's incredible. So how does this apply to learning English or making a life change?
Let me give you some very practical examples. If you want to improve your English, you do not need to study for 3 hours every day. A micro change might be to listen to 5 minutes of natural English conversation every morning before you look at your phone. That is it, just 5 minutes. Or it might be to learn 3 new words every day while you drink your coffee, or to write 2 sentences in a journal in English before you go to sleep. None of these things feel life-changing in the moment, but at the end of a year, if you learn 3 words every day, you have added over 1,000 new words to your vocabulary. That is a completely different person.
And the same principle applies to other kinds of changes too, right? Not just language learning?
Absolutely. If you want to change your career, you do not need to quit tomorrow. You might spend 15 minutes per day reading about a new field that interests you. You might send 1 email per week to someone who works in an area you are curious about. You might take 1 free online course over 3 months. These are not dramatic actions, but they are real actions, and they move you forward. And here's the beautiful thing about micro changes. They also help you build what psychologists call self-efficacy, which means your belief in your own ability to succeed. Every small action you complete, no matter how tiny, sends a signal to your brain that says, I am someone who takes action. I am someone who is changing. And that belief becomes the foundation for bigger and bigger steps.
That is so motivating. Now, Anna, I know you wanted to talk about some real examples of people who made big changes later in life. I always find stories like that really inspiring. Can you share some?
I would love to, because these stories are genuinely remarkable, and they completely destroy the myth that success and change belong only to the young. Let us start with someone whose story I find deeply inspiring, Vera Wang. Today, she is one of the most famous fashion designers in the entire world. Her bridal gowns are worn by celebrities and royalty. But Vera Wang did not design her first dress until she was 40 years old. Before that, she had spent her career as a figure skater and then as a fashion editor. 40 years old, and she was just beginning what would become her greatest contribution to the world.
40 years old and just starting. That is amazing. I think a lot of people would have said it's too late at that point.
And that's exactly the point. Now, let me tell you about Harland Sanders. You probably know him better as Colonel Sanders, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken.
He spent most of his life working a variety of jobs. He was a farmhand, a streetcar conductor, a soldier, a railroad fireman, a lawyer, and many other things. He did not begin seriously developing his fried chicken business until he was in his 40s, and he did not franchise the business, meaning sell it to other restaurants, until he was 62 years old. He was 62 years old driving across America in his car, sleeping in the back seat, trying to convince restaurant owners to use his recipe in exchange for a small payment. And from that beginning, one of the world's most recognized brands was born.
That is extraordinary. He was sleeping in his car at 62, not giving up.
And there's more. Let's talk about Julia Child. She's one of the most beloved cooking personalities in American history. She taught millions of people to cook French cuisine through her television programs and her books. But Julia Child did not even learn to cook seriously until she was almost 40 years old. She published her first book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, when she was 49 years old. Her television career began at 50, and she continued working, inspiring people, and contributing to food culture well into her 80s.
Okay, this is genuinely changing something in my mind. I always thought of 40 or 50 as the age when life starts slowing down, but these people were just getting started.
And one more example that I think is particularly powerful for our listeners today. Taikeichiro Mori was a Japanese economics professor who taught at university for his entire career. He did not enter the real estate business until he was 55 years old. He began with one small building. He kept building, kept investing, kept learning. By the time he was in his late 70s, Forbes magazine had named him the richest man in the entire world. He had built an empire, starting at 55, from a single small building.
From a university professor to the richest man in the world, starting at 55. I mean, what excuse does any of us have, really?
None. And I tell these stories not to put pressure on people, not to say you must become wildly famous or wealthy. I tell them to demonstrate that the human capacity for growth, change, and contribution does not expire at 30. It does not expire at 40, 50, or 60. These people succeeded later in life because of their experience, their wisdom, their patience, and their refusal to accept the artificial timeline that society had given them.
I want to ask you about something else that I think really holds people back, and that is the fear of judgment. Like, even if someone internally believes they can change, they are afraid of what other people will say, their family, their friends, their colleagues. How do you deal with that fear?
This is such an important topic, and I am really glad you raised it, because it is probably the most underestimated obstacle people face when they try to make a change. The fear of judgment is not a small or irrational fear. It is deeply biological. Human beings evolved as social creatures. For thousands of years, being rejected by your community was genuinely dangerous. If your tribe rejected you, you could not survive alone in the wild. So our brains are wired to care very deeply about what others think of us. That instinct is not a weakness. It's actually very ancient and very human.
So we should not feel ashamed of feeling that fear.
Never. The first step is to understand that the fear is natural, but the second step is to examine whether the fear is accurate. And here's something that psychology research tells us consistently. We tend to dramatically overestimate how much other people are thinking about us. There's a concept called the spotlight effect, which describes our tendency to believe that we are always in the spotlight of other people's attention, that everyone notices when we make a mistake or try something new or change direction. But the reality is that most people are primarily focused on their own lives, their own worries, and their own stories.
So the spotlight we think is shining on us is mostly in our own imagination.
Mostly, yes. People are far too busy worrying about their own spotlights to spend much time watching yours. And for the people who do comment on your choices, who might say things like, "Why are you changing careers now?" or "Why are you learning English at your age?" It's worth asking yourself one simple question. Where is that person in their own life? Often, the people who are most critical of others who try to change are people who feel stuck themselves and find the sight of someone brave enough to try a little bit uncomfortable.
Your growth can feel like a silent criticism to someone who is not growing. That's not your responsibility.
That's a really honest and kind way of looking at it. It's not that they're bad people, they might just be reflecting their own fears.
Exactly. And for the people who genuinely love you and to express concern because they worry about you, not because they want to hold you back, those people deserve a calm and honest conversation. You can say to them, I understand you're worried and I appreciate that you care about me, but I have thought about this carefully and I believe this change is the right direction for my life. I'm not asking you to agree with me, I'm asking you to trust me. A conversation like that, said with love and confidence, can change the dynamic completely.
That's really practical advice, having actual words ready for that kind of difficult conversation, because sometimes we know what we want to say, but we just can't find the right way to express it.
And this is one of the beautiful connections between English learning and personal development. When you build your vocabulary in English, when you learn to express complex emotions and ideas, you're also building your ability to articulate your inner world. You're developing the language to explain who you are and what you want. That's not just a language skill, that's a life skill.
So learning English is also a form of personal development. It's not just about grammar and vocabulary, it's about becoming a more expressive, more connected version of yourself.
Beautifully said. And I think that brings us naturally to the conclusion of today's conversation, Abel. We've covered so much ground together. We talked about why society's timelines are artificial constructions that don't reflect the full length and possibility of a human life. We talked about how lived experience is not a disadvantage, but actually one of your greatest resources. We talked about the sunk cost fallacy and why honoring your past doesn't mean being imprisoned by it. We talked about micro changes and how tiny, consistent actions create extraordinary transformation over time. We talked about Julia Child and Colonel Sanders and Vera Wang and Taikeichiro Mori and all the proof they give us that the best chapters don't always come first. And we talked about the fear of judgment and how to walk through it with honesty and grace.
And what I'll take away from today, more than anything else, is this idea that the question is not how much time has passed. The question is, what are you going to do with the time that remains? And that question is just as open and just as full of possibility at 40, 50, or 60 as it is at 20.
There is no better way to say it, Abel. The narrative of your life is not finished simply because one chapter didn't go the way you planned. Every single day that you wake up is a page you haven't yet written, and that page is entirely yours. Today is not too late. Today, in fact, is the perfect day to begin, whatever that beginning looks like for you. Whether it's pressing play on an English podcast, writing your first sentence in a new language, sending that one email, or simply deciding in your heart that you deserve a different kind of future. That decision matters, and it's enough to start.
Thank you for being here with us today. And thank you for having the courage to listen, to learn, and to believe that your story is still unfolding in the most beautiful and unexpected ways.